Our next presentation is Air Monitoring Documentation, presented by Joel Craig of Craig Environmental Consulting.
Good morning. The purpose of this presentation is to help other monitoring organizations evaluate the documentation methods that they are using to document the activities in their monitoring sites for their monitoring network. And I'm going to show some options of different electronic document systems that others might consider implementing in their monitoring network. So here I'm showing some of the main points that we're going to discuss in this presentation. But first I'd like to just explain how about 30 years ago I realized how inefficient the documentation system, the paper documentation system that we all used in documenting our air monitoring activities in the field, and realizing that an electronic system could dramatically improve that efficiency. And over the years, I've tried many different electronic systems, and they've evolved as the technology has evolved, and based on what I've seen, worked and didn't work. And so today we're going to really talk about why, what, and how we document the activities in our monitoring stations. So I think it's important first to realize that there is an impact to the monitoring organization's operation of the document system that they're using. And as I mentioned earlier, I realized early on in my career that huge benefits could be realized by moving from a paper documentation style system to an electronic documentation system. So in evaluating the different options that are available, there's a lot of points that need to be considered. And I think the first consideration is that there's probably no system that's best for all organizations. The differences in the monitoring network, the skill level of the staff, and other factors are going to influence what approach really is going to work best for your monitoring organization. But I'd like to start out by pointing out that there really are two main purposes of all this documentation that we generate in our monitoring stations. And one purpose is to validate the data from that site. The calibrations, the log notes, the QC checks, those all are necessary documents that need to be reviewed to validate the site. But a second equally important purpose of our site documentation is to have a record of the history of performance and maintenance that's been performed on each instrument. And so the documentation systems really serve these two purposes. And for smaller organizations that don't move their equipment around, the same style system will typically address both of these purposes. But for larger organizations that do move their instruments around, it's important to realize that your documentation system has to be capable of organizing the documents by site and by individual instrument, regardless of where that instrument was located. So I think the first point to stress on this slide is the importance of good, thorough documentation of all observations and tasks performed in a monitoring site. And I use this line up on the slide: if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen, in a lot of training that I do of new staff, just to stress the importance of this. So on this slide here, we have examples of the things that typically need to be documented. And it's going to vary a little bit from monitoring organization to monitoring organization. And you might note that there are many entries from one document that come directly from another document. For example, if you're doing an ozone multi-point calibration, the photometer you're using as your level 2 or level 3 standard in performing that calibration, it has a certification date, and in the case of a level 3 standard, a certification equation that needs to be applied to the photometer's response. So those are present in the certification document, and if we link all of these documents together, we can increase efficiency and accuracy by automatically filling the fields from one document with another. And this is an important part of getting the maximum efficiency and accuracy from the electronic documentation system. So here on this slide, I'm presenting some different options that I'm aware of for documentation systems for air monitoring stations. And these are just the systems I'm familiar with and aware that either I've used or I know other organizations have used. And I divide them into kind of two categories of paper type systems and electronic type systems. And you'll note that I'm including PDF systems where you generate a PDF, say for a multi-point calibration, maybe of a Excel form that does all your calculations for you, and then you're going to file that PDF away. But all that filing, whether it's electronic or paper filing, that really drags down the efficiency of a system. And it also prohibits the linking of documents within your documentation system. So I grouped those all together. Those work pretty similarly and have some of the same drawbacks. The electronic style systems do allow for more linking of forms in your documentation system, and but are a little more complex in operating. And it's been my observation that the more complex the documentation system is, the more benefit in terms of efficiency and accuracy. So there's a bit of a trade-off. There's an effort to deal with the complexity of setting up an electronic document system, but there's a big payback from that. And I think in almost all cases, the payback is much greater than the effort to set it up and to maintain it. So an important consideration when you're looking at different documentation systems is understanding that your documentation is really driven by your procedures that you use. And these procedures, as we all know, they're constantly evolving. There's new regulations, there's new equipment, there's sometimes staff realizing that there's a better way to perform a particular task in the monitoring station. And so because of this constant evolving of your procedures, there also needs to be the ability to evolve your documentation specifics to match those procedures so it will work well for your monitoring staff. And I think this is an important point of why I feel that monitoring staff really are in the best position to design and keep these documentation systems aligned with their procedures, because they know those procedures. They know what they need in terms of the documentation specifics. And so I think it's important if the monitoring staff are at least intimately involved in the design of an electronic document system, if they're not the actual ones designing and implementing it. So another consideration that we've got to take into account is meeting EPA requirements. EPA has some guidelines in volume 2 of their QA manual about meeting their requirements for electronic documentation systems. And really, these EPA requirements are based on the requirements that have always been in place for paper type documentation systems. And you just have to tweak your approach a little bit in meeting these EPA requirements. And I found them to be relatively easy to meet by various means. So another consideration in order to get the efficiency out of an electronic document system is a scheme or method to, as automated as possible, share your electronic documents. And that's because there's all kinds of different personnel that need to have access to these documents. You need them in the field, maybe in your lab or shop when your repair folks are repairing an instrument. They're going to want to look at the history of that instrument. And the data processing staff, clearly, when they're processing the data from that monitoring site, they need to have access to all of these site documents in order to perform their tasks. Managers also are going to need access to follow what's going on in their monitoring network. And there's quite a few options that I'm aware of, which I've listed here. I really like option one. That's what I use. OneDrive is very simple to use, and there are a few little quirks you have to learn about it, but once you learn those quirks, it's very efficient in sharing these documents. Literally within a minute of creating a new document, it's available to everybody on the system. And I think it's a great way to go. But there's other options available, as I've listed here, that you need to consider which way you're going to share these electronic documents to get the real efficiency out of your electronic document system. So one of the most simple electronic document systems is what I call a grid documentation system. And I've got an example here from some time ago of a BAM full calibration. And in this grid system, there's columns with embedded calculations for all of your data entries. And as you fill out each column, you just scroll to find a new column that's vacant, and you enter your new entry in that column. It is authenticated by when you save the workbook rather than just a normal save. You run a macro that saves the workbook and also creates a PDF of the entire workbook itself. And this has satisfied EPA. I've worked with Region 9 staff as a reasonable way to authenticate your documentation system. This also, though, is a big disadvantage because trying to look through that giant PDF that may be many, many pages long to find the specific entry that you're looking for is very difficult. It's possible to do, but it's very time consuming and is one of the big disadvantages of this kind of system. The other disadvantage of this kind of system is that it's a lot harder to share data between different documents, although it still is possible. And there's a little bit of difficulty in extracting the data for analysis or presentation in a different form. But the big advantage of this system is it's very simple and it's very user-friendly. And a monitoring organization that has staff that are even beginners in Excel can easily set up a system like this and keep it operational. So it's a good option, especially if you don't have any advanced Excel or database users in your organization. The next kind of level up in complication is systems that I'm using now with most of my clients, and it's what I call an Excel's form documentation system. And it's entirely based in Excel, and you navigate from form to form using macro buttons, and each form has fields for you to enter the data, and just like the grid style Excel systems, all of the calculations and conditional formatting is all embedded in the sheets. But the big difference with this is when you go to save a particular form, and the example I have here is another BAM 1020 full calibration. When you go to save it, it actually saves the data from the form in a hidden table in the Excel workbook, and then it creates a PDF image of the actual filled out form and automatically files that PDF image in the correct folder for that site, that parameter, and that task. So it makes it super easy to find the PDF image of a particular entry, unlike the grid systems. It also makes it super easy. Once that data is in the data table, you can display that data. The sky is the limit. You can display that data however you like, whatever format you like it to display in. It's just up to your imagination how you want to display it, graphically, in tables, however you want to do it. The sky is the limit. The big disadvantage is that it is a bit more complicated. There's some moderately complicated macros that need to be implemented in these workbooks. So it does require a bit more skill. I would say you need somebody that's more of an advanced Excel user in order to successfully implement a system like this. But it really is a great system. It works really good. As I say, I have a number of clients that are currently using a system like this. They all really like it and really makes their life easy and has dramatically increased the efficiency of their monitoring program. So the real most advanced system is a true database system to document all of your site activities. And this would typically be using SQL or Access database. And it really is the most flexible in viewing the data however you like to view it. The authentication is a lot easier. It is much more complicated and it requires more staff skills, but it probably would provide the best system in the long run for especially for larger organizations and organizations that have multiple sites and are typically moving instruments around fairly often. This is really the right approach. And I've got a system I'm testing right now using a kind of a hybrid between a true database and Excel. I'm using Excel as the user interface because I think it really works better for that purpose. But then instead of saving the data to a hidden data table in the workbook, all the data is saved and retrieved from Access database tables. So you get kind of the best of both worlds. And I'm hoping to roll this out and provide it to one of my customers for testing here real soon. But it really is a great approach if you have the skills to make it work. So I'm going to demonstrate a Excel form style documentation system, and this is a system that's actually in use for by the Eastern Current Air Pollution Control District, and this workbook is set up for their Ridgecrest monitoring site. And we start out entering the documentation system through the master site workbook that I have displayed here. And it has all the different tasks segregated into different categories. We have general site operation, MET sensors, PM samplers, and gas parameters. And we have all the different associated tasks with them scheduled on when they're due next. And we also have the ability to log into the system, and this master site workbook also acts as the portal to access the other workbooks of the other categories that we're going to be documenting. So the first step is to log in. So I will enter my password here and log in, and it recognizes my password and knows that it's me, and it will then input my initials on any of the documents that I'm going to generate and save. So once we're logged in, then we can access a workbook that's specific to one of the instruments in the monitoring site. And so for this example, we're going to go with the PM10 BAM 1020, and there's a hyperlink that I'm accessing now that allows us to access that workbook. And all the workbooks start out in this settings or control panel screen that lists all the tasks, when they were last performed, when they're due, and some of the details about the site. But the main part of this screen is this control panel. And these macro buttons allow you to navigate to whatever form you want to either retrieve data from or to save data from performing a new task. So let's first go to something simple like a BAM QC check. So here we have two forms. The form on the right is the retrieval form. So all of my sheets are set up that the white cells are cells you're allowed to make entries in. The grayed out cells you're not allowed to make entries in, and they're actually locked to prevent any accidental changes to those cells. So in the date format here, we click on here, there's a drop down that shows all of the different dates and times of QC checks that were performed on this instrument, and we're going to pick one of them, and what it does is populate this form with the data from that QC check. And again, this data is coming from the hidden data table embedded in this workbook. So that's retrieving data, and the form to the left is how we enter data. So for instance, it knows what standards are available. We choose a standard that we're going to use, and it automatically puts the certification date in and eliminates us having to go find that. And it also makes sure that we put the right date in. You notice my initials are already listed under operator in a locked cell. That's part of the password protection that we have in this system. So in the white cells, we enter the dates, the times, the results of the QC check, if we clean the head and cyclone, and once all those are filled out, this message data missing from form will change to all fields entered, okay to save, and we would click this save button. And when we click this save button, what happens is the data we've entered in here in this form gets saved to our hidden table, and then the PDF image of this form itself gets created and automatically filed in the correct file folder in the system. And that's really the way almost all of these forms work. We'll look at a couple others. Here's a full calibration. We have the data retrieval form here. We can retrieve data from previous calibrations, and then we can enter data here also, just like we did in the QC check. So going back to our control panel, there are also, as I've mentioned, once the data is in these hidden tables, it's super easy to display however you like. So one of the things I've done is I've created a sheet that shows all of the activities for that month. And this is super useful in validating that month's data. It goes and looks in the hidden data tables. It retrieves the last 6 months calibration. There's zero background data, when the inlet tube was cleaned, and then the QC checks themselves are presented here. And you'll notice down here, it automatically creates the AQS strings for these QC checks that can be then submitted directly to AQS. So this is part of the power of having the data saved in these tables. Another option for using the data from these tables is you can have it automatically graph. You can set beginning and end date points, and it will automatically graph all of your QC check data to look for trends. So really, like I said, the sky's the limit of different ways you want to display the data once it's in that hidden table. Now, another area that's important is your maintenance records. So here we have a table that shows the history of when maintenance tasks were performed on the sampler itself. And then on the left is a little form here that works just like all the other forms, where we're going to record if new maintenance tasks were performed. That gets saved to the hidden table and will then show up in the maintenance history table here. Now, I've also made it so all these forms have to be filled out completely, or the save button doesn't work. You click on it and nothing happens because it wasn't completely filled out. So that's a quick tour of the BAM workbook. I wanted to also share with you the log and site check workbook. We'll access that next. And again, we're at our control panel. And so if you click here, it allows you to make a site check entry. I like to have the site operators periodically document that they've checked all the common things that could affect validity of data to ensure any problems are caught as quickly as possible. And when this form is filled out, it also automatically creates a log entry to the electronic site log. And if all of the entries for the site check indicated there were no problems, it will automatically say that a site check was performed and all is okay. And then you can add a manual entry to the automated entry before you save the actual entry itself. If, though, you found some issue in one of the questions on your site check, say for instance that when you reviewed the strip charts you found some anomalies, and when you answer yes to that, not only does it notify you that that means there's some issue, but it automatically updates the automatic log entry with the problem that you found in your site check, and allows you then to explain further in your manual entry. So that is how we have the site check part of this workbook set up. There's also a form for just a manual entry if you're not up to your log, if you're not going to be doing a site check. And one of the most powerful parts of this is the retrieval of this data. I have it set up here where you can set a beginning and ending date, and it will automatically display all of the log entries for that site for the period that you've selected. So this is especially helpful when you're validating data and you're looking at each month of data. You can very quickly retrieve all of the site log entries for this site for that entire month or quarter if you were validating it on a quarterly basis. So this gives you a bit of an idea how this form system works. And I'm willing to share examples of these with any organization that would like to pursue this. And just let me know with my contact information what you're interested in. I'd be happy to give you examples and answer any questions and help your staff implement a system similar to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joel. We will now be entering the live Q&A discussion for this session. If you could join me on screen. We do have one question in our Q&A chat. Other attendees, if you could please type additional questions for Joel into the chat now. The question is, how would you make a correction in multiple forms, like correcting a standard cert date, and preserve version control?
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by version control, but it is an important aspect of any electronic system to be able to make corrections, because we all make mistakes. So each of the forms I have set up a little bit differently depending on how likely there is a mistake. So in the case of the wrong certification date, the only way that would happen is when you get a standard back from being recertified, there is a form where you enter the certification date for that standard into the system. So if that was somehow incorrectly entered and then it wasn't detected for quite some time, the question is valid that there would be many records with this wrong certification date. And so for instance, in BAM, QC, and multi-point forms, I have it set up where you can delete a record and then make a new entry. That works pretty good for when there are many or just one mistake, like maybe you entered the flow off the standard wrong and you didn't catch it until after you hit the save button. And that would work great for that type of an approach. If there were many that were incorrect, then I think it would need to be noted in the site log that exactly what the mistake was, exactly what period of time that incorrect date was applied, and if that incorrect date resulted in any calibrations or QC checks that were done with an expired standard, then that would certainly need to be noted also. So I hope that answers the question.
Right. Next question. If you were to do something like this in Microsoft Access, how would it change the functionality?
Well, you could mimic most of this in Access, and there are a lot of benefits for using Access. I'll be real honest, I have done this with Excel because I know Excel so much better than I know Access. I'm learning Access more and more, but I really know Excel. So I think one of the most valid criticisms of the systems I've built is that it probably could have been done in a little bit more elegant fashion if I had used Access rather than Excel. So it could be done in Access exactly the same. Access has the ability to create forms, entry forms and retrieval forms. So you could kind of mimic much of the same stuff using Access. It also, but like I said, I've got a system that I've got together that I'm in the process of testing that kind of uses both, where I'm using Excel as the user interface that does all the calculations of percent difference and best fit line, all those kind of calculations, because that's so easy to do in Excel. But all of the data is actually stored in an Access table and then retrieved and plopped into Excel for the display of that data. Or if you're saving a new form, instead of saving to a hidden table like my system, it saves it to an Access table. So I kind of like that approach, but it also could be done 100% in Access.
Thanks, Joel. Next question. Have you explored the use of smartphone apps for any of these e-forms?
Wow, that's a great idea. No, I haven't, but I like the idea. I'm old and I have poor eyesight, so I think that would be a little hard for operators like me. But nowadays the phones are bigger, and I know some of the clients I work with, they do so much stuff on their phones that's a great idea, and I think it could be done. I just have never explored it.
And I think we have time for one more question. Have you tried to work through cloud repositories such as Laserfish with these forms? Seems they work best based off a file on a specific drive.
That's correct. And that's why for the cloud sharing of data, I selected OneDrive, because with the Windows 10 and greater operating system, you can make OneDrive files, it looks like it's on the C drive. And the way there's a lot of work behind the scenes in these workbooks. It knows where the workbook is installed. So then it also has to know where it's going to file all these PDFs into the separate folders. And so it's really important that it sees that it's located on the C drive. So that's why I've used OneDrive. I've not explored any other cloud systems. You know, nowadays there's so many workarounds. There's probably ways to use other cloud systems. I just never have. And you know, my main point on this presentation is to get other people to kind of start thinking about all these ideas that you're bringing up. So, you know, my hope is that other people can kind of learn from what I've done and maybe make something that's better that I had not even considered in my work.
All right. Thank you, Joel, for being here. We will be ending the session shortly, so please move on to the next session on data validation. Thank you.
Thank you.